The fluorescent lights of Lagos General Hospital flickered above Grace Morgan's head as she sat on the cold metal bench outside the intensive care unit, and every flicker felt like another second stolen from her mother's life. Her hands trembled as she clutched the crumpled medical bill in her fists, the numbers blurring through her tears because no matter how many times she read them, they never got smaller. 3 million naira. 3 million naira to save the only person who had ever truly loved her.
Before we dive into the full story, please subscribe to our channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from.
To understand Grace's journey, we must go back to where it all started. Grace was 20 years old, a final year student at the University of Lagos studying accounting, and she had always believed that hard work and determination could solve any problem. But this problem was different because this problem had a price tag she could never afford, and every hour that passed without treatment was another hour her mother slipped further away from her. She had spent the last 3 days running from one hospital administrator to another, begging for mercy, pleading for time, promising payments she had no idea how to make. And all she got in return were sympathetic looks and firm rejections. Her mother, Helen Morgan, had collapsed in their small apartment in Yaba 4 days ago, and by the time the ambulance arrived, she was barely breathing. The doctors said it was a severe kidney infection that had spread to her bloodstream, and without immediate dialysis and intensive care, she would die within a week. Grace had watched her mother's vibrant smile fade into a pale, lifeless expression on that hospital bed, and the sight had shattered something deep inside her chest. Her mother had raised her alone after her father died in a car accident when Grace was only 7 years old, working 3 jobs to put her through school, never complaining, never asking for help from anyone. Now it was Grace's turn to help, but she had nothing. Her part-time job at a small bookstore in Ikja paid barely enough for her own expenses, and her savings account held exactly 47,000 naira. She had sold her laptop, her phone, and every piece of jewelry she owned, but it was like trying to fill an ocean with a teaspoon. The hospital had stopped administering medication 2 days ago because the bill had climbed too high without payment, and Grace could see her mother deteriorating with each passing hour. The nurses looked at her with pity, but pity didn't pay bills, and sympathy didn't save lives. That morning, Grace had made the decision she had been dreading for days. She would go to her uncles for help. Her mother had 3 younger brothers, and although they had never been particularly close to Helen, after she married a man they didn't approve of, Grace hoped that blood would mean something in a moment like this. She took a bus to Serula, where her uncle Thomas lived in a comfortable 3-bedroom flat, and when he opened the door, she saw the recognition in his eyes followed immediately by something cold and distant. "Grace," he said, not inviting her in, "what brings you here?" She explained everything, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush, and she watched his face harden with each sentence. When she finished, Uncle Thomas crossed his arms and shook his head slowly. "Things are hard now, Grace, very hard. I have my own family to take care of, my own children to send to school. I can't just throw away 3 million naira like that." "I'm not asking you to throw it away," Grace said, her voice breaking. "I'll pay you back every kobo, I promise. I just need help now because Mum doesn't have time." Uncle Thomas's wife appeared behind him, and Grace saw her whisper something in his ear. He nodded and turned back to Grace. "I'm sorry, I can't help you. Try your other uncles." The door closed in her face, and Grace stood there for a long moment, feeling something inside her crack. But she couldn't give up. She took another bus to Festac town where Uncle Michael lived, and then another to Lekki where Uncle Richard had his house. The responses were variations of the same theme. "Things are hard, we have our own problems. Maybe if your mother had been more reasonable over the years, we would be closer. Ask someone else." But it was Uncle Richard, the youngest of the 3, who delivered the final blow that nearly destroyed her. He stood in his expensive doorway wearing a designer shirt and gold watch, and he looked at Grace with something that made her skin crawl. "You know, Grace, your mother has always been a proud woman. Too proud. When your father died, I offered to help her. I offered her everything, but she rejected me. She said she would rather struggle alone than accept my help. And you know what? Let her live with that decision now." Grace felt her stomach twist. "What are you talking about?" Uncle Richard's smile was ugly and mean. "I wanted to be there for her, to take care of her the way a woman should be taken care of, but she treated me like I was nothing. So now, when she's dying and desperate, why should I help? Tell your mother that if she wants to die, she should go ahead and die. I won't lose any sleep over it." The words hit Grace like physical blows, and she suddenly understood what he was really saying. He had wanted a sexual relationship with her mother, his own brother's widow. And when Helen had refused him with dignity and strength, he had turned his rejection into hatred. And now he was willing to let her die because his ego was more important than her life. Grace left that house feeling like she was drowning, and the bus ride back to the hospital passed in a blur of tears and despair. When she finally walked through the doors of the intensive care unit, she found her mother lying on the bed exactly as she had left her, pale and still, with tubes running from her arms and an oxygen mask covering her face. The monitors beeped steadily, but Grace knew those beeps were counting down to an ending she couldn't bear to imagine. She pulled a chair close to the bed and took her mother's cold hand in hers. "Mum," she whispered, "I'm trying, I promise I'm trying, I won't let you go, I won't." But as she sat there in the dim light of the hospital room, listening to the machines that were keeping her mother alive, Grace felt the weight of her own powerlessness crushing her from all sides. She had no money, no family support, and no options left. The bill was still climbing, the treatment was still stopped, and time was running out faster than she could count. A nurse entered the room to check the monitors, and Grace looked up at her with desperate, red-rimmed eyes. "Please," she said, her voice raw, "please just give her the medication, just start the treatment. I'll pay. I promise I'll find a way to pay. I'll do anything, just don't let her die." The nurse's expression was kind but firm. "I'm sorry, Grace, I really am, but those aren't my rules. The hospital has policies, and if we break them for one person, we have to break them for everyone. The bill needs to be paid before we can continue treatment." "But she's dying," Grace whispered, and the words felt like knives in her throat. "I know," the nurse said softly, "I'm so sorry." After the nurse left, Grace stayed beside her mother's bed, holding her hand and watching her breathe, and she made a silent vow in that moment. She would find a way. She didn't know how, she didn't know where, but she would find a way to save her mother's life because losing her was not an option she was willing to accept. Whatever it took, whatever price she had to pay, she would pay it. She just didn't know yet how high that price would be. Would Grace find help in time to save her mother? Or would desperation drive her to a choice that would change her life forever? The answer would come from the most unexpected place, and it would cost her more than money. Grace spent the night in the hospital corridor, curled up on the hard bench with her head resting on her folded arms, and sleep came in broken fragments filled with nightmares of her mother's funeral. Every time she jerked awake, her first instinct was to check her phone for missed calls, for messages, for any miracle that might have appeared while she slept. But there was nothing. Just the empty screen and the growing weight of hopelessness pressing down on her chest like a boulder she couldn't move. By morning, her body ached from the uncomfortable position, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional agony that consumed her. She washed her face in the hospital bathroom, looking at her reflection in the cracked mirror and barely recognizing the hollow-eyed girl staring back at her. Grace had always been strong, had always found ways to survive and push forward, but this situation was different because strength alone couldn't conjure 3 million naira out of thin air. She splashed cold water on her face and made her way back to her mother's room, praying that somehow things would look different in the morning light. They didn't. Her mother lay motionless in the bed, her breathing shallow and labored, and the monitors showed numbers that Grace had learned to dread. The oxygen levels were dropping, the heart rate was irregular, and every metric screamed that time was running out faster than Grace could comprehend. She sat beside the bed and held her mother's hand, whispering promises she didn't know how to keep, and that was when she heard the doctor's footsteps approaching down the hallway. Dr. Okonkwo was a tall man in his late 40s with kind eyes and a gentle manner, but even his kindness had limits when it came to hospital policy. He entered the room with a clipboard in his hands and an expression that told Grace everything she needed to know before he even spoke. "Grace," he said softly, "we need to talk about your mother's condition." "I know," Grace said quickly, standing up. "I know the bill is getting higher, but please, Dr. Okonkwo, please just start the treatment. Her condition is getting worse. I can see it. She needs the dialysis now, she needs the antibiotics, she needs everything you said she needed. I'll find the money, I promise I'll find it." Dr. Okonkwo shook his head slowly, and Grace saw the genuine regret in his eyes. "Grace, I understand your situation, I really do. But your mother's bill has now reached 3.5 million naira and it's still climbing. Without immediate payment, the hospital cannot authorize further treatment. I've tried to push for exceptions, I've spoken to the administrators, but the policy is clear. We need at least 2 million naira deposited before we can continue." 2 million, Grace felt the room spin around her. "But I don't have 2 million, I don't have anything. How am I supposed to get that kind of money?" "I don't know," Dr. Okonkwo said honestly. "But I need you to understand something. Your mother doesn't have much time left. Maybe 3 days, maybe 4 at most. Without intervention, the infection will overwhelm her system completely. I'm sorry to be so blunt, but you need to know the reality of the situation. Grace felt her knees weaken, and she grabbed the edge of the bed to steady herself. 3 days, maybe 4, that was all her mother had left unless Grace could perform a miracle she didn't believe in. There has to be something, she whispered. There has to be some program, some charity, something that can help us. I've already checked, Dr. Okonkwo said, his voice heavy with sympathy. Every fund and charity program has waiting lists months long, and they require extensive documentation and verification. We don't have that kind of time. I wish I had better news for you, Grace, I truly do. After the doctor left, Grace stood in that hospital room feeling like she was standing on the edge of a cliff with nothing but darkness below her. She had exhausted every option, begged every person she could think of, and still she was no closer to saving her mother than she had been 3 days ago. The helplessness was suffocating, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Grace felt herself breaking under the weight of it all. She needed air, she needed to think, she needed to scream. Grace kissed her mother's forehead and walked out into the hallway, her vision blurred with tears, and that was when she saw Dr. Okonkwo speaking with another doctor near the nurses' station. She approached them, ready to beg one more time, ready to throw herself at their feet if that was what it took, because dignity meant nothing when your mother was dying. Dr. Okonkwo, she called out, and both doctors turned to look at her. Please, I'm begging you. There has to be something we can do. Some payment plan, some arrangement, anything. My mother can't die because I don't have money. That's not fair, that's not right. Dr. Okonkwo opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a voice came from behind Grace, smooth and deep and filled with quiet authority. Excuse me, I couldn't help but overhear. What seems to be the problem? Grace turned around and found herself looking at a man she had never seen before, and her first thought was that he didn't belong in a place like this. He was tall and imposing, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit that probably cost more than Grace's entire year of school fees, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money or bills or dying mothers. His face was handsome in a sharp, angular way, with dark eyes that seemed to see too much, and there was something about his presence that made the entire hallway feel smaller. It's a private matter, Dr. Okonkwo said diplomatically, but Grace was too desperate to care about privacy or pride or anything else. My mother is dying, Grace said, her voice shaking. She needs treatment that costs millions of naira and I don't have it. I've tried everything. I've begged everyone. And now they're telling me she has 3 days left and I can't do anything to save her. The stranger studied her with those dark, penetrating eyes, and Grace felt exposed under his gaze, like he could see every desperate thought running through her mind. How much do you need? He asked simply. 2 million naira to start the treatment, Grace said, barely daring to hope. But the total bill is 3.5 million and growing. The stranger nodded slowly, and Grace saw something flicker across his face, an expression she couldn't quite read. That's a significant amount of money. I know, Grace whispered. I know it is, but she's my mother, she's all I have, and I would do anything to save her. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Grace was too distraught to fully consider. The stranger tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with something between hope and fear. Anything, he repeated softly. Yes, Grace said without hesitation, anything. The stranger reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek business card, holding it between 2 fingers like a playing card in a game Grace didn't understand. My name is Daniel Okoy, he said. I can pay your mother's medical bills, all of them, today, right now. The treatment can start immediately and you won't have to worry about money ever again when it comes to her care. Grace felt her heart stop in her chest, and for a moment she thought she must be dreaming or hallucinating from exhaustion and grief. You would do that, for a stranger. Yes, Daniel said calmly, but I need something from you in return. And there it was, the catch, the price. Grace had known it was coming because nothing in life was free, especially not 3 million naira from a man in an expensive suit who looked at her like she was a puzzle he wanted to solve. What do you need? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel stepped closer to her, and Grace caught the scent of expensive cologne and something else, something that made her instincts scream at her to run even as her desperation rooted her feet to the ground. 1 night, he said quietly, so only she could hear. You spend 1 night with me, and in return I pay every naira of your mother's bills and ensure she gets the best possible care. It's a simple transaction. Grace felt like she had been slapped. Her mouth went dry and she took a step backward, shaking her head. No, I can't do that, I'm not that kind of person. I'm not suggesting you are, Daniel said, his voice still calm and reasonable, like they were discussing a business deal and not something that made Grace feel sick to her stomach. I'm offering you a choice, your principles or your mother's life. Only you can decide which one matters more. The words cut through Grace like a knife because he was right, and that was the worst part. He was offering her exactly what she had said she wanted, a way to save her mother, a miracle, and all it would cost was one night, one choice, one decision that would change everything about who she was. I'm a virgin, she heard herself say, and she didn't know why that mattered except that it did, that it felt important for him to know that this wasn't something she had ever considered before. Daniel's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened slightly. I understand. The offer stands regardless. Think about it, take your time, but not too much time because your mother doesn't have that luxury. He held out the business card, and Grace found her hand reaching for it automatically, like her body was making decisions her mind couldn't process. The card was heavy and expensive, embossed with gold lettering that read Daniel Okoye, CEO Okoye Industries, along with a phone number. Call me when you've made your decision, Daniel said. Day or night, I'll answer. Then he walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hospital corridor, and Grace stood there clutching the business card in her trembling fingers. She looked down at it, at the name and number that represented both salvation and damnation, and she felt something inside her chest crack open. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be the choice she was being forced to make. But it was, and she knew it, and the knowledge was destroying her from the inside out. Grace walked back to her mother's room in a daze, and she sat beside the bed, holding Helen's cold hand while staring at the business card. One night, one choice, one decision that would save her mother's life but cost Grace something she could never get back. She thought about her mother's sacrifices, about the 3 jobs Helen had worked to put her through school, about the nights Helen had gone hungry so Grace could eat. She thought about Uncle Richard's cruel words and the cold rejection from her family. She thought about her mother dying alone in this hospital bed because Grace didn't have money. And she thought about Daniel Okoye's dark eyes and his calm voice offering her a devil's bargain that she didn't know if she was strong enough to refuse. Grace pulled out her phone and stared at it for a long time, the business card in her other hand, and she felt tears streaming down her face because she already knew what choice she was going to make. She had known it the moment Daniel walked away. She had known it the moment he said her mother's life could be saved. With shaking fingers, Grace typed the number into her phone and stared at it on the screen. All she had to do was press call. All she had to do was say yes. All she had to do was sacrifice herself to save the person she loved most in the world. Would Grace make the call that would save her mother but destroy her innocence? Or would she find another way before time ran out? The answer would come before midnight, and it would seal her fate in ways she couldn't imagine. Grace sat in that hospital room for hours, watching the sun move across the sky through the small window, and every minute that passed felt like a battle between who she was and who she might have to become. The business card burned in her hand like it was made of fire, and she must have picked up her phone and put it down again 100 times because each time she tried to make the call, her fingers froze and her heart screamed at her to find another way. But there was no other way. She had searched every corner of her life for alternatives, and they had all led to dead ends and closed doors. Her mother stirred slightly in the bed, making a small sound of pain, and Grace immediately stood up and leaned over her. "Mum, can you hear me? I'm here, I'm right here." But Helen's eyes remained closed, and after a moment she went still again, lost in whatever dark place the illness had taken her. Grace felt fresh tears streaming down her face because this was what it came down to. Her mother was slipping away while Grace sat paralyzed by fear and shame, and a desperate need to preserve something that suddenly felt selfish in the face of death. What was her virginity compared to her mother's life? What was one night of sacrifice compared to a lifetime of regret if she let Helen die because she was too afraid to make the hard choice? Grace had been raised to believe that her body was sacred, that intimacy was something special to be shared with someone she loved, but those beliefs felt like luxuries she could no longer afford. Rich people had the privilege of principles because they never had to choose between their morals and their survival. But Grace wasn't rich, and she didn't have that luxury, and she was learning exactly what desperation could make a person do. She looked at her phone again, and this time before she could stop herself, she pressed the call button. Her heart hammered in her chest as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and she almost hung up, almost threw the phone across the room and ran away from this decision. But then a voice answered, smooth and calm and exactly as she remembered it. Daniel Okoye. "It's Grace," she said, and her voice came out broken and small. "Grace Morgan from the hospital." "I know who you are," Daniel said, and she could hear something in his tone that might have been satisfaction or triumph or maybe just simple acknowledgement. Have you made your decision? Grace closed her eyes and forced the words out before she could change her mind. Yes, I'll do it. I'll spend the night with you if you pay my mother's bills and make sure she gets the treatment she needs. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Grace wondered what he was thinking, whether he felt victorious or guilty or nothing at all. You're sure? He asked finally. I need to know that you're choosing this freely, that you won't change your mind later. I'm sure, Grace lied, because she wasn't sure of anything except that her mother was dying and this was the only option left. When do you want to meet? Tomorrow night, Daniel said. I'll send a car to pick you up from the hospital at 8 o'clock. Bring whatever you need. The arrangement will be for one night only, and the following morning I'll have my accountant transfer the full amount to the hospital. Your mother's treatment will begin immediately. How do I know you'll keep your word? Grace asked, and she hated how weak she sounded, how powerless. You don't, Daniel said bluntly. But you don't have any other choice, do you? You'll have to trust me. The line went dead, and Grace sat there holding the phone, feeling like she had just sold her soul to the devil and wasn't even sure if the devil would honor the contract. But she had made the choice, had crossed a line she could never uncross, and now all she could do was pray that it would be worth it. She stood up on shaking legs and walked out into the hallway, finding the first nurse she could see. Please, she said, please tell Dr. Okonkwo that the money is coming. Tomorrow, the full amount. My mother's treatment can start. The nurse looked skeptical, and Grace couldn't blame her because she had probably heard desperate promises before from families who had nothing. Are you certain about this? We can't start treatment based on promises alone. I'm certain, Grace said, and she made her voice as firm as she could manage. The money will be here tomorrow, I guarantee it. The nurse nodded slowly and walked away to relay the message, and Grace returned to her mother's bedside, taking Helen's hand in hers. I did it, Mum, she whispered. I found a way to save you. You're going to be okay. You're going to get better. I promise. But even as she spoke the words, she felt something inside her breaking because the cost of that promise was higher than her mother would ever know. Grace spent the rest of that day and all of the next preparing herself for what was coming, and the preparation felt like mourning. She went back to her small apartment in Yaba and stood in the shower for an hour, scrubbing her skin until it was red and raw, as if she could wash away the decision she had made. She looked through her meager wardrobe trying to find something appropriate to wear, and the absurdity of that thought almost made her laugh, because what did you wear when you were selling yourself to save your mother's life? In the end, she chose a simple blue dress that her mother had bought her for her 19th birthday, and she put it on with trembling hands. Her roommate Jennifer was out at her evening classes, and Grace was grateful for the solitude because she didn't think she could have explained this to anyone without falling apart completely. She sat on her bed and stared at the clock, watching the hours crawl toward 8 o'clock, and every minute felt like a step closer to an execution. She thought about running away, about disappearing into the crowded streets of Lagos and never looking back. But then she thought about her mother lying in that hospital bed, about the machines that were keeping her alive and the medication she desperately needed. And Grace knew she couldn't run because running would be the same as murder. At 7:30, she packed a small bag with a change of clothes and basic toiletries, and her hands shook so badly she could barely zip it closed. She wrote a note for Jennifer saying she would be gone for the night and not to worry, and she knew Jennifer would worry anyway because that was what friends did. Grace looked at herself one last time in the cracked mirror by the door, and the girl staring back at her looked like a stranger, pale and hollow-eyed, and already grieving for something she hadn't lost yet. The bus ride back to the hospital took 40 minutes, and Grace spent every second of it fighting the urge to vomit. She arrived at 7:55 and stood outside the main entrance, watching the street for a car that would take her to Daniel Okoy and whatever waited for her beyond this night. Other people passed by her, families visiting sick relatives, doctors finishing their shifts, and Grace wondered if any of them could tell just by looking at her what she was about to do. At exactly 8 o'clock, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up to the curb and the driver stepped out. He was an older man in a crisp uniform, and his face was professionally neutral as he opened the back door for her. Miss Morgan, Mr. Okoy sent me to collect you. Grace nodded because she didn't trust her voice, and she climbed into the back seat of the car. The interior was all soft leather and tinted windows, and it smelled like money and power, and everything Grace had never had. The driver closed the door and got back behind the wheel, and as the car pulled away from the hospital, Grace felt like she was leaving behind the last piece of her old life. They drove through the streets of Lagos, past the familiar chaos of Yaba and into the more affluent areas of Victoria Island, and Grace watched the city transform around her. The buildings got taller, the streets got cleaner, and the people walking on the sidewalks looked like they had never known what it meant to be desperate. The car finally pulled up to a towering residential building with a doorman and marble floors visible through the glass entrance. And Grace realized this was where Daniel lived, in a world so far removed from hers that they might as well have been on different planets. The driver helped her out of the car and escorted her to the elevator, pressing the button for the penthouse floor. "Mr. Okoye is expecting you," he said, and then he was gone, leaving Grace alone in the elevator as it climbed higher and higher. She watched the numbers tick upward and felt her stomach drop with each floor because there was still time to run, still time to press the emergency stop button and flee this place. But she didn't because her mother was worth more than her fear. The elevator doors opened directly into a massive penthouse apartment, and Grace stepped out into a space that looked like something from a magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Lagos skyline, expensive art hung on the walls, and everything was perfect and pristine and intimidating. Daniel stood by the windows with his back to her, his hands in his pockets, and when he turned around, Grace saw that he had changed out of his suit into casual slacks and a white shirt that made him look younger and somehow more dangerous. "Grace," he said, and his voice was softer than she remembered. "Thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy for you." "Nothing about this is easy," Grace said, and she was surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "But I'm here. I kept my part of the agreement. Will you keep yours?" Daniel walked toward her, and Grace forced herself not to step back even though every instinct screamed at her to maintain distance. He stopped a few feet away and pulled out his phone, tapping on the screen a few times before turning it to show her. "I've already initiated the transfer. 3.5 million naira to Lagos General Hospital, with specific instructions that it's to be applied to Helen Morgan's account. By tomorrow morning, the hospital will confirm receipt, and your mother's treatment will begin immediately." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes because he had actually done it, had actually kept his word before she had even fulfilled her end of the bargain. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do that first? What if I change my mind and leave?" "Then you leave," Daniel said simply, "and I'll be out 3.5 million naira. But I don't think you'll leave because you came here to save your mother, and you're the kind of person who keeps her promises even when they destroy her." The words hung in the air between them, and Grace realized that Daniel Okoye saw her more clearly than she was comfortable with. He gestured toward the living area. "Would you like something to drink? Wine? Water? This doesn't have to be clinical or cold. We can talk first if you'd like." "I don't want to talk," Grace said, "because talking would only make this harder and more real. I just want to get this over with." Something flickered across Daniel's face, an expression that might have been disappointment or sadness, but it was gone too quickly for Grace to be sure. "All right," he said quietly. "Follow me." He led her through the penthouse to a bedroom that was bigger than Grace's entire apartment, with a massive bed and soft lighting and windows that showed the glittering lights of Lagos at night. Grace set down her bag and stood there awkwardly, not knowing what to do or say, and she felt like she was watching herself from outside her body, like this was happening to someone else. Daniel approached her slowly, giving her time to move away if she wanted to, but Grace stayed frozen in place. "I need you to know something," Daniel said, his voice low. "I won't hurt you, I'll be as gentle as I can, but if at any point you need me to stop, you tell me. The money is already transferred. Your mother will be taken care of regardless of what happens here tonight." Grace looked up at him, searching his face for signs of cruelty or mockery, but all she saw was something that looked almost like concern. "Why are you being kind to me?" she whispered. "You're paying me to sleep with you, you don't have to be kind." "Maybe I want to be," Daniel said, and then he kissed her, and Grace felt the last of her resistance crumble because there was nowhere left to run and nothing left to protect. Would the night ahead destroy Grace completely, or would she find unexpected strength in her darkest moment? And what secrets was Daniel Okoye hiding behind his carefully controlled exterior? Grace woke to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and for one confused moment she didn't remember where she was or how she had gotten there. The bed beneath her was impossibly soft. The sheets were Egyptian cotton that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and everything around her screamed luxury and wealth. Then the memories came flooding back like a tidal wave, and Grace felt her chest tighten with a complicated mix of shame, relief, and something else she couldn't quite name. The night had been nothing like she expected. Daniel had been gentle, almost tender, taking his time in ways that made Grace wonder if this was really a transaction or something that felt dangerously close to intimacy. There had been pain because of course there had been pain, but Daniel had stopped multiple times to make sure she was okay, to ask if she needed a break, to remind her that she could still walk away. And Grace had hated him for that kindness, because it would have been easier if he had been cold and cruel. Easier to wrap this experience in the armor of victimhood, rather than face the uncomfortable truth that parts of the night hadn't been entirely terrible. She turned her head and saw that the other side of the bed was empty, the sheets pulled back neatly, and she didn't know whether to feel relieved or abandoned. Grace sat up slowly, wincing at the soreness in her body, and she pulled the sheet around herself as she looked around the enormous bedroom. Her clothes from last night were folded neatly on a chair, and her bag sat beside them untouched. Everything felt surreal, like she had stepped into someone else's life for a few hours and now had to figure out how to step back into her own. The door opened and Grace instinctively clutched the sheet tighter, but it was only Daniel entering with a tray in his hands. He was already dressed in dark jeans and a casual shirt, his hair slightly damp like he had just showered, and when he saw she was awake, something softened in his expression. "Good morning," he said quietly. "I brought you breakfast. I wasn't sure what you liked, so I made a bit of everything." Grace stared at him, completely thrown off balance because this wasn't how transactions were supposed to work. He wasn't supposed to make her breakfast or look at her with eyes that held something warmer than satisfaction. "You didn't have to do that," she managed to say. "I know," Daniel said, setting the tray on the bedside table. There were pancakes, fresh fruit, orange juice and coffee, all arranged like something from a hotel room service menu. "But you need to eat, and I figured you'd be more comfortable eating here before you get dressed." He moved to leave, giving her privacy, but Grace found herself speaking before she could stop herself. "Daniel, wait." He turned back and Grace struggled to find the right words. "Last night, you were. Thank you for being kind. You didn't have to be." Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment something like pain flashed across his face. "Grace, I need you to understand something. What happened last night, the way we came together. It's not something I'm proud of. I took advantage of your desperation, and no amount of gentleness changes that fact." "But you kept your word," Grace said. "You transferred the money before anything happened. You gave me the power to leave. And yet you stayed because you had no real choice," Daniel countered, his voice rough. "Your mother was dying and I exploited that. Don't make me into something noble just because I wasn't a complete monster about it." The honesty in his words was jarring, and Grace found herself seeing him differently, not as the villain she had built up in her mind, but as someone who carried his own weight of guilt and shame. "The hospital," she said, changing the subject because this conversation was going places she wasn't ready to explore. "Did they confirm the transfer?" Daniel nodded and pulled out his phone, showing her an email. "Confirmed at 6 this morning. The full amount has been received and applied to your mother's account. Dr. Okonkwo has already been notified, and your mother's treatment began 2 hours ago. She's receiving dialysis as we speak, along with the antibiotics and other medications she needs." Grace felt something break open inside her chest, and suddenly she was crying, huge gasping sobs that came from a place too deep for words. Her mother was getting help. Her mother was going to live. The nightmare that had consumed her life for the past week was finally over, and the relief was so overwhelming that it physically hurt. She buried her face in her hands, and she didn't even realize Daniel had moved until she felt him sit on the edge of the bed and place a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he said softly. "Let it out. You've been carrying this alone for too long." "I sold myself," Grace choked out between sobs. "I sold myself to save her, and I don't know how to live with that." "You made an impossible choice in an impossible situation," Daniel said, and his voice held a heaviness that suggested he understood more about impossible choices than Grace had realized. "You did what you had to do to save someone you love. That doesn't make you weak or shameful. It makes you human." Grace looked up at him through her tears, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. There was guilt there, yes, but also something that looked like genuine care, and it confused her because this wasn't supposed to be complicated. This was supposed to be a simple transaction, finished and done, so why was he still being kind to her? "I should go," she said, pulling away from his touch. "I need to get to the hospital and see my mother." "Of course," Daniel said, standing up quickly. "I'll have my driver take you, but Grace, please eat something first. You need your strength." Grace wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain some dignity by rejecting his continued kindness, but her stomach was empty, and she was exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness. She ate the breakfast while Daniel waited in the living room, giving her space to dress in privacy, and the food was delicious in a way that made her angry because even his cooking was perfect. When she emerged fully dressed with her bag in hand, Daniel was standing by the window looking out at Lagos, and he turned to face her with an expression she couldn't read. "Before you go," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a business card identical to the one he had given her at the hospital. "I want you to have this. If you or your mother need anything, medical bills, medication, follow-up care, anything at all, you call me. No strings attached this time. I mean it. Grace took the card hesitantly, searching his face for signs of manipulation or hidden agendas. Why would you do that? We had an agreement. One night, it's done. Because your mother shouldn't have to suffer because of choices I made, Daniel said simply. And because despite everything, I don't want you to think I'm completely heartless. I don't think that, Grace admitted quietly, and it was true. Whatever Daniel Okoye was, heartless wasn't the word she would use. Complicated, maybe, troubled, definitely, but not heartless. The ride to the hospital passed in a blur, and Grace spent the entire time staring out the window, trying to process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. She had sacrificed something precious to save her mother, and now her mother would live, but Grace didn't feel victorious or relieved. She felt hollow, like she had traded one part of herself for another, and wasn't sure if the exchange had been worth it. When the car pulled up to the hospital entrance, Grace thanked the driver and hurried inside, desperate to see her mother with her own eyes. Dr. Okonkwo met her in the hallway outside the intensive care unit, and his face was transformed by a genuine smile. Grace, the payment came through just as you said it would. Your mother is responding well to the treatment. The dialysis is clearing the toxins from her blood, and the antibiotics are already bringing down the infection markers. It's early yet, but I'm cautiously optimistic about her recovery. Grace felt fresh tears spring to her eyes, but these were different tears, tears of relief and gratitude rather than despair. Can I see her? Of course, Dr. Okonkwo said. She's sedated for the dialysis, but you can sit with her. Grace entered her mother's room and found Helen looking more peaceful than she had in days. The deathly pallor had faded slightly from her skin, and the monitors showed numbers that were moving in the right direction. Grace pulled a chair close to the bed and took her mother's hand, holding it gently. I did it, Mum, she whispered. I saved you. You're going to be okay now. Everything is going to be okay. But even as she spoke the words, Grace knew they weren't entirely true because nothing would ever be the same again. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had made a choice that would follow her for the rest of her life. And somewhere across the city in a penthouse apartment overlooking Lagos, a man named Daniel Okoye was probably thinking similar thoughts, carrying his own burden of guilt for a transaction that had felt less like business and more like something neither of them knew how to define. Grace stayed at the hospital all day, watching the medical team work on her mother, and every improvement felt like a small miracle. By evening, Helen's condition had stabilized enough that Dr. Okonkwo felt comfortable reducing some of the monitoring equipment, and he told Grace that if things continued improving at this rate, her mother might even regain consciousness within the next day or two. It was the best news Grace had heard in weeks, and she clung to it like a lifeline. When visiting hours ended, Grace finally forced herself to leave and take the bus back to her apartment in Yaba. Jennifer was home, studying at her desk, and she looked up when Grace entered with concern written all over her face. Grace, where were you last night? I got your note, but I was worried. You looked so stressed before you left. I had to take care of something, Grace said, avoiding her friend's eyes. But it's done now. My mum's treatment has started and she's getting better. Jennifer's face lit up. That's amazing. How did you manage to pay the bills? Did your uncles finally help? No, Grace said quietly. I found another way. Something in her tone must have warned Jennifer not to push further because she simply nodded and changed the subject, talking about her classes and campus gossip while Grace half listened. But later that night, alone in her bed, Grace pulled out Daniel's business card and stared at it in the darkness. She should throw it away, should cut all ties with the man who had bought a night with her body, but instead she found herself tucking it carefully into her wallet. And she hated herself a little bit for that, for not being able to completely sever the connection to someone who represented both her darkest moment and her mother's salvation. 3 days later, Helen Morgan opened her eyes for the first time since the treatment began, and when she saw Grace sitting beside her bed, she smiled weakly. Baby, she whispered, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube. What happened? You've been sick, Mum, Grace said, fighting back tears. Really sick, but you're getting better now. The doctors say you're going to make a full recovery. Helen squeezed her daughter's hand with what little strength she had. The bills, how did you pay the bills? Don't worry about that, Grace said quickly. It's taken care of, all that matters is that you're okay. But Helen knew her daughter too well, and even in her weakened state, Grace saw suspicion and worry cloud her mother's eyes. Grace, what did you do? I did what I had to do, Grace said firmly. And I'd do it again. Now rest, you need to focus on getting stronger. Helen wanted to ask more questions. Grace could see it in her face, but exhaustion pulled her back toward sleep before she could press further. Grace sat there holding her mother's hand and wondered how long she could keep the truth hidden, and whether the secret would eventually destroy the relationship she had sacrificed everything to preserve. Would Grace's secret remain buried, or would the truth about Daniel Okoye come crashing into her carefully rebuilt life? And why couldn't she stop thinking about the man who had bought her for a night, but treated her with unexpected tenderness? 3 weeks passed, and Grace tried to rebuild her life piece by piece, but the cracks kept showing through no matter how hard she worked to cover them. Her mother was recovering beautifully, growing stronger each day, and the doctors were talking about discharge within another week. It should have been a time of pure joy and relief, but Grace found herself haunted by memories she couldn't shake and a business card she couldn't bring herself to throw away. She had gone back to her classes at the university, thrown herself into her final year studies with desperate intensity, but even surrounded by friends and familiar routines, she felt like she was living behind glass, separated from everyone by a secret that weighed heavier with each passing day. Jennifer had noticed the change and kept asking what was wrong, but Grace just smiled and said she was tired from spending so much time at the hospital. It was easier than explaining that she had sold herself to save her mother and couldn't stop thinking about the man who had bought her, because that was the truly confusing part. Grace found herself replaying moments from that night, not the painful or shameful parts, but the gentle touches, the concerned looks, the way Daniel had made her breakfast and held her while she cried. She hated herself for those memories because they made everything more complicated than it should have been. Grace was walking through the campus courtyard on a Thursday afternoon, her backpack heavy with textbooks, when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer because unknown numbers usually meant bill collectors or spam calls, but something made her swipe to accept. "Hello. Grace, it's Dr. Okonkwo from the hospital." His voice sounded strained, and Grace felt her stomach drop because good news never came from doctors who sounded like that. "I need you to come to the hospital right away. It's about your mother." "What happened?" Grace demanded, already running toward the campus gate to catch a bus. "Is she okay? Did something go wrong with the treatment?" "She's physically fine," Dr. Okonkwo said carefully. "But there's been a complication with the billing. Can you come? It's better if we discuss this in person." Grace made it to the hospital in record time, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. When she found Dr. Okonkwo in his office, his expression was troubled, and there was another man with him, someone from hospital administration wearing a suit and carrying a tablet. "Grace, please sit down," Dr. Okonkwo said, and the kindness in his voice made her even more nervous. "What's going on?" Grace asked, gripping the edge of the chair. "You said my mother is okay." "She is," the administrator said, looking at his tablet. "But we've run into an issue with the payment that was made for her treatment. The 3.5 million naira that was transferred to cover her bills came from an account that's now under investigation by the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. "What does that mean? Is the money not good?" "The money is legitimate," Dr. Okonkwo assured her quickly. "But the source of the funds is being questioned as part of a larger investigation into several Lagos businesses. The EFCC has frozen the account temporarily while they conduct their inquiry, and they've requested information about all recent large transactions, including the payment made for your mother's care." "So what happens now?" Grace asked, her voice shaking. "Do I have to pay the money back? Does my mother stop getting treatment?" "No, nothing like that," the administrator said. "The payment has been processed and accepted. Your mother's treatment will continue without interruption. But the EFCC has asked to speak with you about how this payment was arranged. They want to understand the nature of your relationship with the account holder." "Daniel Okoye," Grace whispered, and both men nodded. "What kind of investigation? What are they looking into?" Dr. Okonkwo exchanged a glance with the administrator before answering. "I don't have all the details, but apparently, Mr. Okoye's company is being investigated for possible financial irregularities. I want to stress that this doesn't necessarily mean he's done anything wrong. These investigations happen all the time with large businesses, and most of them turn out to be routine audits." But Grace barely heard the reassurance because her mind was spinning with implications she didn't want to face. What if Daniel was involved in something illegal? What if the money he had used to save her mother was stolen or laundered? What if her desperate bargain had somehow made her complicit in crimes she didn't even understand? "When do they want to talk to me?" she asked numbly. "An agent will be here tomorrow morning at 10, the administrator said. "Just tell them the truth about how the payment was arranged. You're not in any trouble, Grace. They just need to verify the transaction. Tell them the truth. Grace almost laughed at the absurdity of it, because how was she supposed to tell EFCC agents that a billionaire had paid her mother's medical bills in exchange for one night of sex? How was she supposed to explain that without destroying her mother, herself, and possibly Daniel in the process? She left the hospital in a daze, and without consciously deciding to do so, she found herself pulling out Daniel's business card and dialing his number. He answered on the second ring. "Grace, is everything all right? Is your mother okay?" "She's fine," Grace said, and then the words tumbled out in a rush. "But the hospital called me. They said your account is under investigation by the EFCC and they want to talk to me about the payment you made." "Daniel, what's going on? What kind of trouble are you in?" There was a long silence on the other end, and when Daniel finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. "Where are you right now? Can we meet? This isn't a conversation we should have over the phone." 20 minutes later, Grace was sitting in a quiet cafe in Victoria Island, and Daniel walked in looking more tired than she had ever seen him. He slid into the seat across from her and ordered 2 coffees before turning his full attention to her face. "First, I need you to understand that you're not in any danger. The investigation has nothing to do with you, and the money I used to pay your mother's bills was completely legitimate." "Then why are they investigating you?" Grace demanded. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands, and Grace saw the weight he was carrying. "My company, Okoi Industries, is one of the largest importation firms in Lagos. We bring in goods from overseas and distribute them throughout Nigeria. About 6 months ago, one of my business partners got involved in some dealings that weren't entirely legal. He was using our shipping routes to bring in contraband alongside legitimate goods, and I didn't know about it until recently." "What kind of contraband?" Grace asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Mostly high-end electronics that weren't properly declared to avoid customs duties," Daniel said. "Nothing violent or dangerous, but still illegal. When I found out, I fired him immediately and reported everything to the authorities. But now the EFCC is investigating the entire company to make sure I wasn't involved or profiting from his schemes." Grace leaned back in her chair, trying to process this information. "And were you involved, I mean?" "No," Daniel said firmly, meeting her eyes. "I swear to you, Grace, I had no idea what he was doing. My company has always operated legally, and when I discovered the violations, I turned him in myself. But investigations like this take time, and until they're satisfied that I'm clean, all my accounts are frozen and every transaction is being scrutinized." "Including the money you paid for my mother," Grace said quietly. "Yes," Daniel admitted. "I'm sorry, I never meant to drag you into this. When they talk to you tomorrow, just tell them the truth. Tell them that you needed money for your mother's medical bills, that we met at the hospital and that I offered to help. You don't have to tell them anything more than that." "But they'll want to know why," Grace said, her voice rising. "They'll want to know why a billionaire would randomly pay millions of naira for a stranger's medical bills. What am I supposed to say to that?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that shocked Grace to her core. "Tell them I'm your boyfriend." Grace stared at him. "What?" "Tell them we're in a relationship," Daniel said, leaning forward. "That we met a few months ago, that we've been seeing each other, and that I paid your mother's bills because I care about you. It's a simple explanation that doesn't require you to reveal anything personal or shameful, and it's believable enough that they won't dig deeper." "But it's a lie," Grace protested. "We're not in a relationship, we barely know each other." "I know," Daniel said, "but it's a lie that protects both of us. Grace, if you tell them the real reason I paid those bills, it won't just affect you. It will become public record. Your mother will find out, your friends will find out, and you'll be branded in ways that will follow you for the rest of your life. Is that really what you want?" Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes because he was right, and she hated that he was right. The truth would destroy everything she had been trying to protect. "And what do you get out of this lie?" she asked suspiciously. "What's in it for you?" "Maybe I just don't want to see you hurt any more than you already have been," Daniel said softly. "Maybe I'm trying to do the right thing for once." Grace wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that his motives were pure, but trust was a luxury she had learned to live without. "If I do this, if I lie to the EFCC and tell them we're together, that makes me complicit in your problems. What happens if they find out you really were involved in your partner's illegal activities? What happens to me then?" "They won't find anything because there's nothing to find," Daniel said. "Grace, I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking you to make a practical choice that protects both of us from unnecessary exposure. After tomorrow, after you talk to the investigators, we never have to see each other again if that's what you want. But for right now, for this one moment, I need you to play along. Grace looked at him across the small cafe table, this man who had bought her body but treated her with tenderness, who had made an impossible offer that saved her mother but now threatened to expose her darkest secret. And she realized with a sinking feeling that she didn't have a choice, not really, because the alternative was too devastating to consider. Fine, she said finally. I'll tell them we're together. I'll play the role of your girlfriend. But Daniel, if you're lying to me, if you're involved in something criminal and you're using me as cover, I will never forgive you. I'm not lying, Daniel said, and something in his eyes made Grace want to believe him. And Grace, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for putting you in this position. I'm sorry for all of it. He reached across the table and took her hand, and Grace felt that same confusing warmth she had felt in his penthouse, that same dangerous connection that she didn't know how to define. They sat there in silence for a long moment, two people bound together by circumstances neither of them had chosen, and Grace wondered how much more complicated this situation could possibly become. The next morning, Grace sat in a hospital conference room across from two EFCC agents, and she told them the lie that Daniel had crafted. She said they had met at the hospital, that they had been dating for several months, that he had offered to pay her mother's bills because he cared about her. The agents asked questions, took notes, and seemed satisfied with her answers. And when it was over, when Grace walked out of that room, she felt like she had crossed yet another line she could never uncross. Her phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. How did it go? They believed me, Grace typed back. Your lie worked. There was a pause and then another message appeared. Thank you, I know this wasn't easy for you. If you need anything, I'm here. Grace stared at those words, at the casual intimacy they implied, and she realized that Daniel Okoye had somehow managed to weave himself deeper into her life despite her best efforts to keep him at a distance. She should delete his number, burn his business card, and forget he ever existed. But instead, she found herself typing a response. We need to talk about what happens next. This fake relationship of ours needs ground rules if we're going to make it believable. Dinner tonight, Daniel suggested. I know a quiet place where we can talk privately. And Grace, despite every logical reason to say no, despite every warning bell ringing in her head, found herself typing one word. Okay. Had Grace just made another deal with the devil? Or was Daniel Okoye something more than the villain she had painted him to be? And what would happen when a fake relationship built on lies and secrets started to feel dangerously real? The restaurant Daniel chose was elegant and discreet, tucked away in a quiet corner of Ikoyi where the wealthy went to avoid attention. And when Grace walked in wearing the nicest outfit she owned, she felt completely out of place among the designer dresses and expensive jewelry. But Daniel was already there waiting for her, and when he stood up and smiled at her approach, Grace felt something flutter in her chest that she absolutely did not want to feel. This was supposed to be a business meeting to discuss the logistics of their fake relationship, not a real date. But the way Daniel pulled out her chair, and the soft lighting, and the intimate table for two made it feel dangerously like something more. Thank you for coming, Daniel said once they were both seated. I know you probably have 100 reasons to hate me right now, but I appreciate you being here. I'm not here because I want to be, Grace said, though the words came out less harsh than she intended. I'm here because you've somehow managed to entangle me in your life in ways I never agreed to, and now we need to figure out how to navigate this mess without destroying each other. Daniel winced slightly, and Grace saw genuine regret flash across his face. You're right. I've dragged you into my problems and that's not fair, so let's establish some ground rules like you suggested. What do you need from this arrangement to feel safe? Grace had spent the entire afternoon thinking about this question, and she pulled out a small notebook where she had written down her conditions. First, this fake relationship exists only for the EFCC investigation and anyone connected to it. We don't tell my mother, we don't tell my friends, and we don't make it public beyond what's absolutely necessary. Second, you don't contact me unless it's related to maintaining this cover story. No random calls, no surprise visits, no blurring the lines between what's fake and what's real. And third, the moment the investigation is over, this arrangement ends completely, and we go back to being strangers. Daniel listened carefully, and when she finished, he nodded slowly. Those are reasonable conditions. I can agree to all of them. But Grace, there's one complication we need to address. If the EFCC decides to dig deeper, they might want to verify our relationship beyond just a single interview. They might ask to see evidence that we're actually together, photographs, witnesses, that sort of thing. So what are you saying? Grace asked, though she already knew where this was going and dreaded it. I'm saying we might need to be seen together publicly, Daniel said carefully. Not often, just enough to establish a credible timeline. A few dinners, maybe an event or two, things that couples normally do. And we should probably exchange some text messages and calls that would look natural if anyone ever checked our phone records. Grace felt her carefully constructed walls starting to crumble because every additional layer of this deception brought her closer to Daniel in ways that scared her. This is getting too complicated. We're building an entire fake life together just to cover up one night. I know, Daniel said, and he reached across the table like he was going to take her hand before catching himself and pulling back. And I'm sorry. But Grace, think about the alternative. If the truth comes out, it won't just be embarrassing for you. It could be used against me in the investigation. They could claim I was involved in human trafficking or exploitation, and suddenly a transaction between two consenting adults becomes something criminal. Grace hadn't thought about it from that angle, and the realization made her stomach twist. You're saying if they find out the real reason you paid my mother's bills, they could use it to prove you're a criminal. They could try, Daniel admitted. And even if the charges didn't stick, the publicity alone would destroy both of our reputations. So yes, this fake relationship is complicated and uncomfortable, but it's the best protection either of us has right now. The waiter arrived with their food, and Grace realized Daniel had already ordered for both of them, somehow knowing exactly what she would like without asking. It was a small thing, but it bothered her because it suggested he had been paying more attention during their one night together than she had realized. They ate in silence for a while, and Grace found herself watching him, studying the way he moved, the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested he carried more stress than he showed. The moments when his mask slipped and she saw something vulnerable underneath. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said finally, "and I want you to be honest with me." "Of course," Daniel said, setting down his fork and giving her his full attention. "That night in your penthouse, the way you were with me, the gentleness and the concern, was that real or was it part of some game you were playing?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment and Grace saw emotions warring across his face. "It was real," he said finally. "Grace, I'm not going to pretend I'm some kind of saint. I made you an offer that exploited your desperation and that's something I'll have to live with. But from the moment you walked into my apartment, I saw your strength and your pain and something in me wanted to make it less terrible for you. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but it wasn't a game." It was never a game. Grace felt her defenses cracking, and she hated it because it was so much easier to see Daniel as the villain than to acknowledge he might be a complicated human being who had made questionable choices just like she had. "I can't stop thinking about that night," she admitted quietly. "And I hate myself for it because I should want to forget everything about you. But instead I keep remembering how you made me breakfast and held me while I cried. And I don't know what to do with those memories." "Maybe you don't have to do anything with them," Daniel said softly. "Maybe they just exist and that's okay." Their eyes met across the table, and Grace felt something shift between them, something dangerous and undeniable that made her heart race. This was exactly what she had been trying to avoid, this blurring of lines between what was fake and what was real, but she couldn't seem to stop it from happening. "We should talk about something else," she said, breaking the moment. "Something practical. If we're going to pretend to be a couple, I need to know things about you. Basic things. Where you grew up, what you studied, your favorite food, the kind of details a girlfriend would know." Daniel seemed relieved by the change of subject, and they spent the next hour exchanging biographical information like students cramming for an exam. Grace learned that Daniel was 32 years old, that he had grown up in Enugu but moved to Lagos for university, that he had studied business and finance, and had built his company from nothing over the past decade. He learned that Grace was studying accounting, that she loved reading mysteries and hated horror movies, that her favorite food was jollof rice and fried plantains because it reminded her of Sunday dinners with her mother when she was a child. The conversation flowed more easily than Grace expected, and she found herself laughing at some of Daniel's stories about his early business failures and the ridiculous situations he had gotten himself into while learning to navigate Lagos's complicated commercial landscape. And Daniel listened to her talk about her dreams of becoming a financial consultant and helping small businesses manage their money. And the way he looked at her made Grace feel seen in ways she hadn't experienced before. When dinner ended and Daniel walked her to his car to drive her home, Grace felt confused and conflicted because this had felt less like a strategy meeting and more like an actual date with someone she genuinely enjoyed spending time with. "Thank you for dinner," she said as they drove through the Lagos night traffic. "And for listening. I know this situation is strange for both of us." "It doesn't have to be strange," Daniel said, glancing at her. Grace, I know we started this relationship in the worst possible way, but maybe we can make something better out of it. Maybe we can actually become friends. Friends, Grace repeated, testing the word. Is that what we are? I don't know what we are, Daniel admitted, but I'd like to find out if you're willing. Grace didn't answer because she didn't know what to say, and they rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence. When Daniel pulled up outside her apartment building in Yaba, he looked at the modest structure with interest. This is where you live. It's not a penthouse overlooking the city, Grace said defensively, but it's home. I wasn't judging, Daniel said quickly. I was just thinking about how different our worlds are and how we somehow ended up colliding anyway. Grace reached for the door handle, ready to escape back into her familiar life, but Daniel's voice stopped her. Grace, wait, there's something I need to tell you before you go. She turned back to face him, and the expression on his face made her nervous. What is it? The investigation is moving faster than I expected, Daniel said. My lawyer called this afternoon and said the EFCC wants to interview me again next week, and they've requested that you be present as well. They want to see us together, to observe our interactions and verify the relationship. Grace felt panic rising in her chest. What does that mean? What do we have to do? It means we need to be convincing, Daniel said. We need to act like a real couple, with the kind of comfort and familiarity that comes from spending time together. Grace, I know this is asking a lot, but we need to spend more time together before that interview. We need to make this relationship look and feel authentic. How much more time? Grace asked, though part of her already knew the answer. As much as possible, Daniel said. Starting this weekend. I'm supposed to attend a business gala on Saturday night, and it would be strange if I went alone when I'm supposedly in a relationship. I need you to come with me as my date. Grace's mind immediately went to practical concerns. I don't have anything appropriate to wear to a gala. I can't afford that kind of dress. I'll take care of it, Daniel said. Everything you need, dress, shoes, accessories, I'll handle all of it. You just need to show up and play the part of my girlfriend for a few hours. This is getting too deep, Grace whispered. Too complicated, too real. I know, Daniel said, and he finally did what he had been restraining himself from doing all evening. He reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm against hers. But we're in this together now, Grace, and I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure you come through this safely. Grace looked down at their joined hands and felt her resolve wavering because his touch reminded her of that night in his penthouse, of the tenderness he had shown her, of the way he had made her feel like she mattered. One gala, she said finally. I'll go to one event with you, but Daniel, I need you to understand something. My heart is not part of this bargain. You bought one night with my body, but you don't get to buy my feelings, no matter how kind you are or how much time we spend together. Daniel's expression was unreadable as he released her hand. I wouldn't want to buy your feelings, Grace. If you ever developed feelings for me, I'd want it to be because you chose to, not because you felt obligated or manipulated. Grace got out of the car and walked toward her building, and she could feel Daniel watching her until she disappeared inside. Jennifer was already asleep when Grace entered their shared apartment, and she was grateful for the privacy because she needed time alone to process everything that had happened. She lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, and she tried to convince herself that she was still in control of this situation, that she could spend time with Daniel without falling for him, that she could maintain her emotional boundaries while playing the role of his girlfriend. But deep down, Grace knew she was lying to herself because somewhere between the hospital hallway and tonight's dinner, Daniel Okoye had stopped being just the man who had bought her and started becoming someone she actually cared about. And that realization terrified her more than anything else because she had promised herself she wouldn't let this happen, wouldn't let him into her heart, but her heart apparently hadn't gotten the message. Grace pulled out her phone and looked at Daniel's last text message, the one confirming their plans for the gala, and she felt her chest tighten with emotion she didn't want to acknowledge. She was falling for him, slowly but inevitably, like sliding down a slope she couldn't climb back up. And the worst part was that she didn't know if Daniel felt the same way or if this was still just a convenient arrangement for him, a way to maintain his cover story while the investigation played out. Her phone buzzed with a new message, and Grace's heart jumped when she saw it was from Daniel. I know you said I shouldn't contact you unless it's necessary, but I wanted to say goodnight. Sleep well, Grace, and thank you for giving this a chance. It was such a simple message, such a normal thing for a boyfriend to send, but it made Grace's eyes sting with unexpected tears because she wanted it to be real. She wanted Daniel to genuinely care about her, wanted this fake relationship to transform into something authentic, wanted to believe that something good could come from the terrible circumstances that had brought them together. But wanting something didn't make it true, and Grace had learned long ago that fairy tales didn't happen to girls like her. She typed back a simple response, "Good night, Daniel," and then she turned off her phone and closed her eyes, praying that she would find the strength to protect her heart before it was too late. Was Grace already too far gone to save herself from heartbreak? Or could Daniel be the unexpected miracle she never knew she needed? And when Saturday's gala forced them to play lovers in front of Lagos's elite, would their pretend romance become impossible to distinguish from the real thing? Saturday arrived faster than Grace wanted, and when Daniel's driver came to pick her up in the afternoon, she felt like she was preparing for battle rather than a gala. Daniel had sent a stylist to her apartment that morning with 3 designer dresses to choose from, and Grace had selected a deep emerald gown that made her feel like someone she didn't recognize, elegant and sophisticated, and completely out of her depth. The stylist had done her hair and makeup, transforming her from a struggling university student into someone who could believably belong on the arm of a billionaire. But Grace kept staring at her reflection, wondering who this stranger was, and what had happened to the girl who used to think 50,000 naira was a fortune. The car took her to Daniel's penthouse first, and when she stepped out of the elevator wearing the emerald dress and silver heels, she found Daniel waiting in the living room wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that made him look devastatingly handsome. He turned when he heard her approach, and the expression on his face when he saw her made Grace's breath catch, because there was no hiding the genuine admiration and something deeper that looked dangerously like desire in his eyes. "Grace," he said softly, walking toward her, "you look absolutely stunning." "It's just the dress and makeup," Grace said, suddenly self-conscious. "The stylist did all the work." "No," Daniel said, stopping directly in front of her and looking at her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. "The dress is beautiful, but you're the one who makes it extraordinary. Grace, I need to tell you something before we go to this gala, and I need you to really hear me." Grace's heart started racing because the way he was looking at her didn't feel like pretend anymore. "What is it?" Daniel took a deep breath, and Grace saw vulnerability in his face that she had never witnessed before. "These past few weeks spending time with you, getting to know you beyond that first night, it's changed something in me. I know this started as a fake relationship to protect us both, but Grace, somewhere along the way, it stopped being fake for me. I've fallen in love with you, and I need you to know that before we walk into that gala and pretend to be something we're not." Grace felt like the floor had dropped out from under her, and she took a step backward, shaking her head. "Daniel, don't do this. Don't say things you don't mean just to make this arrangement more believable." "I'm not saying it for the arrangement," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm saying it because it's true and because I'm tired of lying about what I feel. Grace, I know I don't deserve you. I know the way we started was wrong and that you have every reason to hate me. But I love you. I love your strength and your courage and the way you sacrificed everything for your mother. I love the way you challenge me and refuse to let me hide behind my money and power. I love you, and I needed you to know that before we spend tonight pretending." Tears were streaming down Grace's face, ruining the makeup the stylist had spent an hour perfecting, but she didn't care because her heart was breaking and healing at the same time. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "And I've been so scared because I didn't want to be the girl who fell for the man who bought her. I didn't want our story to be that simple or that complicated. But Daniel, I can't stop thinking about you, and every time we're together, it gets harder to remember why I'm supposed to keep my distance." Daniel closed the space between them and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Then don't keep your distance. Let this be real, Grace, not because we have to pretend for an investigation, but because we both want it. Let me love you the right way, the way I should have from the beginning." "But what about my mother?" Grace asked, her voice breaking. "How do I tell her that I'm with the man who paid her medical bills? How do I explain how we really met without breaking her heart?" "We'll figure it out together," Daniel said. "Maybe we don't tell her everything right away. Maybe we just introduce me as your boyfriend and let the relationship develop naturally in her eyes. Grace, I know there are complications and obstacles, but I also know that I don't want to lose you. I don't want this to end when the investigation is over. I want a real future with you." Grace looked up into his eyes and saw the truth there, saw the love and the hope and the fear that maybe she wouldn't choose him. And in that moment, standing in his penthouse wearing a borrowed dress and feeling more herself than she had in months, Grace made the choice to let go of her fear and embrace something that felt like destiny. "I want that too," she said. "I want us to be real." Daniel kissed her then, and it was nothing like their first night together. That night had been transactional and desperate, but this kiss was filled with promise and tenderness and the beginning of something beautiful. When they finally pulled apart, Both of them were smiling through their tears, and Grace felt like maybe fairy tales could happen to girls like her after all. The gala was held at one of Lagos's most exclusive hotels, and when Grace and Daniel walked in together, every eye in the room turned to watch them. Grace felt exposed and nervous, but Daniel kept his hand on the small of her back, a constant reassuring presence that reminded her she wasn't alone. They mingled with other guests, and Grace watched Daniel navigate the social landscape with practiced ease, introducing her as his girlfriend to business associates and friends who looked at her with curiosity and speculation. "So you're the mysterious woman who finally captured Daniel Okoye's heart," one elegant older woman said, studying Grace with sharp eyes. "I didn't think anyone would ever get past his walls. What's your secret, dear?" "I don't have a secret," Grace said honestly. "I just saw him for who he really is, not who everyone thinks he should be." The woman smiled and patted Grace's hand. "Then you're exactly what he needs. Hold on to him, dear. Good men are rare." As the evening progressed, Grace found herself actually enjoying the gala, and she realized it was because she wasn't pretending anymore. She was genuinely happy to be there with Daniel, genuinely proud to stand beside him, and genuinely excited about the future they might build together. They danced together under the crystal chandeliers, and Daniel held her close and whispered in her ear that she was the most beautiful woman in the room. And Grace believed him because she could see the truth in his eyes. Halfway through the evening, Daniel's lawyer appeared and asked to speak with them privately. They stepped out onto a quiet balcony, and the lawyer's face was serious. "I have news about the investigation. The EFCC has concluded their inquiry into Okoye Industries. They found no evidence of your involvement in your former partner's illegal activities, Daniel. You're completely cleared, and all your accounts are being unfrozen as of Monday morning." Grace felt relief wash over her so powerful that her knees nearly gave out, but Daniel steadied her with an arm around her waist. "That's incredible news," Daniel said. "Thank you for all your work on this." "There's one more thing," the lawyer said, looking at Grace. "They did verify your relationship as part of their due diligence, and they confirmed that the payment for the medical bills was a legitimate personal expense with no connection to any business dealings. You're both in the clear." After the lawyer left, Grace and Daniel stood on the balcony looking out at the Lagos skyline, and Grace felt like a weight she had been carrying for months had finally been lifted. "It's over," she said. "The investigation, the lies, all of it, we're free." "Does that change anything for you?" Daniel asked quietly. "Now that you don't have to pretend anymore, do you still want this? Do you still want us?" Grace turned to face him and took both his hands in hers. "Daniel Okoye, I want you more now than ever because now I know it's real. Now I know we chose each other not because we had to, but because we wanted to." Daniel pulled her into his arms and held her tight, and Grace felt safe and loved, and exactly where she was meant to be. They stayed on that balcony for a long time, making plans and dreaming about the future. And when they finally rejoined the gala, everyone could see that something had shifted between them, that they weren't just playing a role but living a truth. 2 months later, Grace stood in her mother's hospital room on the day Helen was finally being discharged, and she knew it was time to introduce the man who had saved them both. Daniel had been patient, never pushing, always letting Grace set the pace of their relationship, but she was ready now to bring these two parts of her life together. When Daniel walked into the room carrying flowers, Helen looked at him with curiosity and something that might have been recognition. "Mum," Grace said, her voice nervous but determined. "This is Daniel Okoye. He's my boyfriend and he's someone very special to me." Helen studied Daniel for a long moment, and Grace held her breath wondering if somehow her mother had figured out the truth. But then Helen smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes. "It's wonderful to finally meet you, Daniel. Grace has told me so much about you. Thank you for being there for her during this difficult time." "It's my honor, Mrs. Morgan," Daniel said, and Grace could hear the sincerity in his voice. "Your daughter is the most remarkable woman I've ever met, and I'm grateful every day that she came into my life." Over the following months, Grace and Daniel built a relationship on a foundation of honesty and love, and they told Helen a version of the truth that protected her from unnecessary pain while still honoring the reality of their connection. Grace finished her final year at university with honors, and Daniel was there at her graduation, cheering louder than anyone else when she walked across the stage. Helen regained her strength and returned to work, and she welcomed Daniel into their small family with open arms, never knowing the full story of how he had saved her life. A year after that night in the hospital hallway, Daniel took Grace to a quiet beach in Calabar and got down on one knee in the sand. "Grace Morgan," he said, holding out a ring that caught the sunset light. You came into my life during my darkest moment and showed me what it means to be truly brave. You taught me that love isn't about transactions or agreements, but about choosing each other every single day. Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of the gift you've given me? Grace said yes before he even finished the question, and when he slipped the ring onto her finger, she felt like every painful step of her journey had led her exactly where she needed to be. They were married 6 months later in a beautiful ceremony at a church in Lagos, with Helen crying happy tears in the front row and Jennifer serving as Grace's maid of honor. It was a small, intimate wedding, because both Grace and Daniel had learned that the best things in life weren't measured by size or expense, but by the depth of love and commitment they represented. As Grace stood at the altar in her white dress, looking into Daniel's eyes while they exchanged vows, she thought about the desperate girl who had sat in a hospital hallway with a crumpled medical bill and no hope. She thought about the impossible choice she had made and the unexpected love that had grown from the darkest moment of her life. And she realized that sometimes the worst circumstances could lead to the most beautiful outcomes, that sometimes you had to lose everything to find what really mattered. "I promise to love you," Grace said, her voice clear and strong. "Not because of what you've given me or what you can provide, but because of who you are and who we become together. I promise to choose you every day in good times and bad, and to build a life with you that honors everything we've overcome to get here." "I promise to love you," Daniel said, his eyes shining with emotion. "Not as the girl I bought for a night, but as the woman who taught me what it means to truly give and receive love. I promise to spend every day earning your trust and proving that our story isn't defined by how it started, but by how we choose to write it together." They kissed as husband and wife, and the small church erupted in applause and cheers, and Grace felt her heart overflow with joy because this was her happy ending, the one she had stopped believing in but had found anyway. As they walked back down the aisle together, Grace caught her mother's eye and saw Helen smiling through her tears, healthy and happy and completely unaware of the secret sacrifice her daughter had made to save her life. Later, at the reception, as Grace danced with Daniel under fairy lights and surrounded by people who loved them, she whispered in his ear, "Do you ever regret how we started? Do you wish we had met some other way?" Daniel pulled back to look at her, his expression serious and thoughtful. "I regret that you had to go through so much pain and that I contributed to that pain. But do I regret that it brought you into my life? Never. Grace, I believe we were meant to find each other, and maybe the universe knew that we both needed to be broken before we could be whole together." Grace rested her head on his shoulder and let herself be held, and she thought about destiny and choice and the mysterious ways that life could transform tragedy into triumph. She had started this journey as a desperate student, willing to sacrifice anything to save her mother, and she was ending it as a woman who had found not just love but herself in the process. She had learned that strength came in many forms, that redemption was possible even in the darkest circumstances, and that sometimes the person you least expected could become the greatest gift life had to offer. As the night wore on and the celebration continued around them, Grace and Daniel stood together watching their friends and family dance and laugh, and they held hands like they would never let go. They had survived the investigation, the lies, the secrets, and all the obstacles that had threatened to tear them apart, and they had emerged stronger on the other side. Their story wasn't perfect, and the beginning would always carry shadows that they would have to live with, but the middle and the ending were beautiful beyond measure. "I love you, Mrs. Okoye," Daniel said, testing out her new name. "I love you too," Grace replied, and she meant it with every fibre of her being. "Thank you for seeing me, for really seeing me, when I felt invisible to everyone else." "Thank you for giving me a second chance," Daniel said, "and for teaching me that love is the only currency that really matters." They kissed under the stars, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and had chosen to build something extraordinary from the ashes of their painful beginning. And as Grace looked around at the life she had built, at her healthy mother laughing with guests, at her husband holding her like she was precious, at the future stretching out before them full of possibility, she knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. Because sometimes love didn't arrive like a fairy tale, wrapped in perfect circumstances and easy choices. Sometimes it came through fire and pain and impossible decisions. Sometimes it started in the darkest moment of your life and grew into the brightest light you had ever known. And sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that had to fight for their happy ending, the ones that proved that redemption was real and that people could change and grow and become better versions of themselves. Grace and Daniel's story was one of those stories, messy and complicated and absolutely perfect in its imperfection. And as they danced together at their wedding reception, surrounded by love and promise and hope, They both knew that this was just the beginning of their greatest adventure. Grace had gone from desperate student to beloved wife, and Daniel had transformed from a man who brought love to a man who had learned to earn it. Their journey had been painful and beautiful, shameful and triumphant, and ultimately it had taught them both that true love wasn't about the price you paid, but about the choice you made to keep loving even when it was hard. And they lived happily ever after, not because their story was perfect, but because they had learned that perfect love means loving each other through all the imperfections. If you enjoyed the first part of this story, please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel and turn on your notification bell, so that when we drop another video, you'll be the first to be notified. Thanks for watching.